So let me get this straight. You, as a very privileged person who have got 2 healthy children as far as you know, want me, someone who is experiencing trauma and pain, to put a trigger warning on my child's life to make you feel more comfortable. And that's what kicked off.
I'm Mia Friedman. You're watching No Filter.
Thank you for having me.
You want to start with the sad stuff.
Sometimes you have those days.
I just cried. I just bawled my eyes, and I don't know why.
If you can't be wise, be kind.
I never cry in No Filter interviews.
It was sort of just opening my eyes to a new world.
I love it. I live it and breathe it.
Rach, I want to start by asking you about Mackenzie. Tell me about her.
The love of my life, which now I feel guilty about saying because, I've got other children, but she just changed everything for me. Mackenzie's my firstborn. I did have pregnancies before her, but she was my firstborn little girl. She was born the 11th of March, 2017, and she was just, magic. Like pure perfection.
Did you always know you wanted to be a mum?
Yeah. Yeah, it's interesting. I was listening to your episode about people not knowing, and I've always thought that would be sort of the hardest part is in the space of not knowing, because I've always known deep in my soul, and that puzzle piece when she arrived just clicked into place.
Was it hard to get pregnant with her?
No. It took a couple of months, but when I actually knew what my ovulation window is, because I think we spend so much time in schools turning to lessons about how not to get pregnant, that a lot of people, including me, didn't actually know my fertile window or my ovulation day. So once we got that, we did have a miscarriage before Mackenzie at 6.5 weeks, which was devastating at the time, but unfortunately that's now been buried, for want of a better term, under a lot of other trauma that's piled on top of it, because when Mackenzie was 10 weeks old, she was diagnosed with a terminal condition, a genetic terminal condition called spinal muscular atrophy, and we lost her when she was 7 months and 11 days old.
Those first 10 weeks before you knew, what were they like?
Like I had won the lotto. I literally remember like strutting down the street. Like I had this, I don't know, a new world had been opened to me. I felt like I was getting beautiful attention. My baby was getting beautiful attention. I felt special. This just love. Yeah, it was just, it was pure magic.
How was she diagnosed? Because there were no genetic tests back then. You and your husband were both carriers of a genetic condition that you had not been told about or tested for. How did you find out?
Very quickly, very abruptly. She, at a lactation consultant appointment, they said that she wasn't moving the way that she should. I quickly rushed her to a local GP who very scarily sort of said, it's time, you need to go to see a pediatrician immediately. Got into a pediatrician appointment 2 days later, and within 5 minutes of being at that appointment, he diagnosed her and said it was terminal. So it went from thinking that I was on cloud 9 to just wondering how I was supposed to actually survive to the next day.
How did he deliver that news?
Really abruptly. I mean, I would say that there's no good way to say that news, but I think there's a better way to say that news. Our later interactions with who would become Mackenzie's neurologist were much more pleasant despite the situation. But he just said, I'm pretty sure it's spinal muscular atrophy. And we went, well, what is that? And he said it's terminal. And then when I started to I froze and shut down initially. And then after a couple of minutes, I started like sort of getting really upset, and he told me to calm down, Missy. And that's just burnt in my head. So,
All right.
Did he? Then we were.
Sorry, go on.
Oh, we were made to pay a big bill as we were leaving his office, and we left back home. It wasn't until later that we sort of knew we should have been taken straight down to Sydney Children's Hospital to meet with the neurologist, to not have been left to leave that appointment that way.
Was anyone able to tell you what the future held for Mackenzie?
The neurologist was able to talk to us. We had the first initial discussion as to whether to put her on an experimental trial drug. And then we were told, once we made the decision, that that was not the right way for us and for her, based on a whole number of levels. We were told she would likely either get a cold and go in and out of hospital for a lot of her life until she just got so weak she couldn't fight it, or we got told that we would wake up one morning and she would just die in her bassinet when we looked in there. Yeah.
How long did you have with her?
So we had 7 months and 11 days. Then, I mean, obviously, only a few months after her diagnosis, yeah.
So, Rach, I mean, I can't even begin. And then everyone says to you, I know, how do you get out of bed? How do you do it? How do you live? Do you have an answer to that?
You've got no choice. I mean, I suppose you do have a choice. There are some people who don't come through it and they do take their own life. There were certainly times where I wished myself to not be here. But for me, after she was diagnosed, we knew that we had to give her everything. So she was our reason of continuing and getting out of bed every day until she passed away. And then after that, all of the days sort of become a blur of pain. And then it became, well, what are we going to do for her to celebrate her life, to help others not go through the same thing? Then it was, how are we going to get her siblings? And so there was always something to fight for. And I put everything I had into those, whether that was healthy always, I don't know, but it was my way of coping.
In terms of trauma, that's it's hard to think of something more traumatic and ongoing than what you experienced. Are there certain things that trigger a response in your body, certain things that abruptly distress you?
Yes, but I mean, there's some kind of obvious ones. I don't think when it comes to triggers, they're not usually obvious for people, even though society wants to assume that they are. They're not. They're very specific and personalized. I mean, my most generic, I suppose, was the sound of ambulances, because Mackenzie stopped breathing at home in my arms and we rushed her lights and sirens in an ambulance to Sydney Children's Hospital, and I just had her in my lap and I was just singing Twinkle, Twinkle, Little Star in her ear as we drove. And so the sound of ambulances, it's not as prevalent a trigger anymore because I have been exposed to it. You don't you don't get a warning.
Yeah.
The ambulances are around. I still have a little bit of because I know that on the end of that ambulance is a family like mine. But my triggers are, for a while, obviously it was pregnancy announcements. I still get triggered by large families, which is strange. I get really triggered, and this is a hard one because I get really triggered by positive thinking or magical thinking or manifestation. I had a trigger the other day, which is quite strange, by Kourtney Kardashian. So
What did she do?
So she was talking about, I didn't see the full article. I didn't go into it because I knew it was, I went into it, but I just didn't. I was like, okay, this is obviously triggering me. And it means that I need to work on it. So she had her recent son had surgery in utero, and the conversation with her was, it was scary, but I knew that if I just thought positively and if I prayed to God, then everything would be okay. And once I started thinking positively, the lungs stopped filling up with fluid. So that's really triggering for a lot of people, especially in the baby loss community, because it's like, or any type of grief or loss, it's like, I did positive thinking. I did everything you could possibly imagine for Mackenzie, to wish and pray and positively make her better. But then I did 9 rounds of IVF. I lost another 2 babies at 16 weeks pregnant that I had to walk into the hospital and say goodbye to. And I did everything. I have done soul work, kinesiology. I have done negative thinking in the hope that it would stop me from falling so far. I've written lists. I've done research. There is not anything that I haven't done. And to hear someone say, well, I prayed right. Yeah. I did the right positive thinking and that's what happened. Like, I understand the space for it, but I find it really triggering.
When you say triggering, can you explain what happens in your body and in your mind?
My heart starts racing. I get really sweaty hands. My brain feels like it's a tornado. I can't catch my thought. It just goes around and around. And then the conversation that I have in my head won't stop for hours.
So what have you learnt is the best way to cope, or a way to cope? How do you cope with that? Because obviously you want to avoid those triggers, but how do you?
Well, I don't avoid the triggers because they're everywhere. Hearing about children who have passed away or any type of grief, that doesn't trigger me. It makes me feel comforted in some ways, and that there are other people who are out there who know how I feel. It makes me sad that someone else knows that pain. Usually if it's someone on Instagram, for instance, I will usually write to them in their DMs and say that I'm here if they are new to this world of grief. But I don't avoid them, because the things that trigger me are not things that come with trigger warnings. Sometimes I'll read it and I will let my body go through what it needs to go through because it's unavoidable. Sometimes I will close an article or close something, but I know that that means that that's something that I need to work on, because a trigger is obviously, it's like a little warning sign of, okay, there's something that's agitated there. I'm probably going to have to work on that.
You said you wrote a fantastic piece first on your Instagram. What led to that post on your Instagram?
So my Instagram is, I normally don't have any, I created that space as a way of sharing Mackenzie. I had no idea that it was going to turn into the space that it is now. But I have been trying so hard for it to still remain my space. It's my space, whether people want to follow me or not. A lot of the people who follow me have experienced some kind of child loss or loss, but I'm also really amazed that there's also a lot of people who haven't experienced loss and they're just here to learn, which I love. I have a lot of people who reach out to me and say, my friend just had a stillborn and thanks to you, I knew the right thing or the wrong thing to say. So that is amazing. But occasionally someone will come across my page, as they do on the internet, and will have an opinion. And most of the time I can block it out. But I remember I got contacted by someone who Instagram had fed me to her as a suggested page. She was pregnant with her second, and she reached out to me to say, you should put a trigger warning on your page. And I engaged in conversation with her, and I said, can you explain to me why you think that? And she said, I'm pregnant with my second, and hearing about the possibility or your life makes me stressed. And I'm like, so let me get this straight. You, as a very privileged person who have got 2 healthy children, as far as you know, want me, someone who is experiencing trauma and pain, to put a trigger warning on my child's life to make you feel more comfortable. And that's what kicked off me writing that post.
It's interesting, your choice of words there. You say, put a trigger warning on my child's life. That's exactly what it is, isn't it? It's saying this might be so upsetting to you, who never knew Mackenzie and who isn't her mother or her father, that I need to put your feelings before my own and before honouring my daughter.
Yeah. It's a way for people to curate their life, because I would say that 99% of the time the people who want the trigger warning haven't experienced that trauma, because most of the people, at least in the child loss community, do not want trigger warnings on their children. We didn't get a warning that this was going to happen to us, and we want to share our child. And to say, put a trigger warning, it's like you're telling me that my life is so bad and it makes you uncomfortable that this exists in the world. So you want to cover me up so you can curate your world on what's positive in your mind. Whereas I see my daughter as positive. Like, yes, extreme pain, but the gifts that she has given me are endless. She's changed me for the better.
You said something really interesting in the piece you wrote about this for Mamma Mia. You said trigger warnings aren't for people who've experienced things, they're for people who are scared of experiencing those things, because they're so often claimed to be protective of the people who have experienced trauma. And maybe in some cases they are. Maybe there are some people who don't want to read about a particular traumatic experience that they've gone through. But that's pretty subjective, isn't it?
Yeah, I still completely agree that they're not for the people who have experienced the trauma, they're for the people who are scared to experience the trauma. And for those who have had the trauma, I do feel bad for any triggering moments, but studies have shown that one of the best ways you're never going to get over, but one of the best ways to process what you've gone through is to have exposures. And I really worry about the curation of life and the feeling that we need to start putting triggers on everything, because, where does it end? Because what triggers me is something that I would never put someone, like a lot in the child loss community, a lot of pregnancy announcements are triggering. And now I'm starting to see pregnancy announcements with trigger warnings for the people who are in the infertility space. And it's like, no, I don't agree with trigger warnings on that either, because that's someone's joy. I just don't believe in trigger warnings at all. I think in some cases they might allow someone to avoid an article for a short period of time, but in the long term, it's not going to do that person any good. And for everyone else, it's going to be negative. It's going to, I guess, make us weak, for want of a better. It's not going to prepare us for life.
So your philosophy is that we have responsibility for our own emotions and our own mental health, and we shouldn't be outsourcing that to the internet. to protect us with trigger warnings?
Yeah, I mean, it's very hard. I feel for people with mental health issues. I am one of them.
Yeah.
I have a lot of diagnoses and I'm on medication, and I do take responsibility for what I consume. If I'm not in the right headspace, then maybe going on the internet's not the place for me. I know that can seem a bit harsh, and I really appreciate that society these days are more inclusive of people with mental health issues. I really appreciate that originally the thought behind it was in the right space, but the research shows that it doesn't work. And I just think that they're doing more harm than good. So it's not for other people to protect me.
You've also spoken and written about trauma creep, the idea, because of course trigger warnings are meant to be for people who have experienced trauma to avoid being re-traumatized. The question of who's traumatized and what trauma is ties into this, doesn't it? Can you explain what trauma creep is?
Yeah, it's the fact that some of the terminology that we use in society is creeping out of the scientific, psychological, behavioral space, and it's coming into everyday language. So, you're wanting something clean. Oh my God, I've got OCD, or I'm traumatized. I've got PTSD from that guy not calling me. It's just this language that's so hyperbolic that's coming into our space. And it's using these really big words in an everyday capacity. And where do the people who actually have OCD, PTSD, where do they actually sit? Because now what my trauma of my child passing away and losing further children and everything else that I've gone through, that sits on par in a conversation, like obviously not when you're going deep, but in a conversation with someone who burnt their tongue on a tea because it was too hot. Like, I just think that we've got such a wide vocabulary in the English language that we can start using some of the less dramatic words. I'm sad. I'm disappointed. I'm upset. I don't like hearing that. Just be careful with your language.
That's beautiful, Rach. Thank you so much. Can you give us your working definition of a trigger warning?
So there's all kinds of warnings you can get for different things, obviously. You can get those like film warnings. You can get warnings for like content containing Indigenous persons. So we're not talking about any of those kind of warnings, although I think film warnings are probably like an early ancestor. But a true trigger warning is something that warns you about something that might be potentially distressing. And that's probably going to be potentially distressing because of something that's happened to you in the past or present. So maybe a traumatic event or like a mental health related issue, could be depression, anxiety, all that kind of stuff. So it's really just warning you about upcoming negative content that's probably related to you in some personal way, rather than just generally negative content.
What would you say is the difference? And you probably answered part of that then, but the difference between a trigger warning and a content warning?
They're sort of one and the same thing. Every now and then trigger warnings will go through a rebrand because they are starting to get more heat against them because of like the evidence coming out, and people will say, I don't think they work. And so people go, oh, well, we're not using a trigger warning anymore. Now we're using a content warning, but it's really the same thing repackaged. I've even seen people say that the term trigger is too triggering because it evokes gun imagery. And so people are saying we shouldn't use that term at all because it's violent. And so maybe we should use like can notes or like, I don't know, other kinds of things. But really they're all doing the same thing. If the purpose of it is to warn people about a mental health related thing or a trauma, which is what they are for, then it's a trigger warning. So that's sort of how I define it. It's like what they're used for rather than what they are, because they come in all different forms and shapes and things.
So what does the science say?
Pretty extensive number of studies now. I think we've got about over maybe 10 to 15. There's probably a few more that have come out since we did our meta-analysis on them. Basically, they don't really do much of anything except for make people feel anxious when they first see them. So people see a trigger warning, they feel a little bit anxious about what's coming up, sort of like apprehension or, anticipatory anxiety. not very large anxiety, but just like a small amount of, something negative's coming. And then when people see the content after that, it doesn't reduce any negative feelings towards it. So it doesn't seem to be doing any of that emotional preparation thing. Can't find any evidence of that at all, even for people like in target groups that people would say, okay, well, you've just looked at the general population. But we've also looked at trauma survivors. We've also looked at people with depression. We've also looked at people with anxiety. And it doesn't seem to help any of these people across the board. Everyone just feels the same when they see the content. And as for avoidance, that is probably more of a weird iceberg scenario where there's so much weird stuff going on with avoidance, with trigger warnings, or just avoidance of negative stuff in general. So I guess people would assume that humans are quite logical beings, that if you see something negative that you don't want to see, you should avoid it. But what we find is humans actually have this huge propensity towards morbid curiosity. And so even though people probably know something's going to make them upset, people want to look at it anyway. And so in a lot of my studies, I found like such a tiny avoidance rate of anything negative, even when we're like continually exposing people to the like nastiest photos in our photo sets, which are quite traumatic photos of actual like dead bodies and things. You can keep showing people them and say to them, you don't have to see them, because we'll have a screen on them, like those Instagram blurred warning screens. And we'll say, you don't have to uncover this if you don't want to, go to the next photo. People will just keep uncovering them again and again and again. So I think in most of our studies, we found like 50% of people will just uncover every single negative photo that we've shown them, which is quite a high number. And then as for like the first few photos, about 80 to 90% of people will instantly uncover that photo. So there is a drop off of like people that do see the negative thing and go, okay, maybe I don't want to look at it anymore. But most people are just keep wanting to look at stuff. So,
and Victoria, what's the difference between that? Because people could argue, well, you've given them a choice, right?
Yeah.
As opposed to the physiological reaction of when that image or those words might just be put in front of me without you telling me that it might distress me or that it's graphic.
I don't think it would make much of a difference, because I just don't think, unless you're specifically instructing somebody on how to reduce that reaction, I don't think the trigger warning is doing anything at all. And it's not, there's no like way to emotionally inoculate yourself just using the language from trigger warnings, unless you're like, maybe if you've been going through like years of therapy or you know about certain emotion regulation techniques, maybe you can, but it's a really like abstract, amorphous thing to ask somebody to like stop themselves having a reaction towards something, or you don't know the technique. So usually when something's negative, it's got something unique and weird about it, socially deviant about it. And so people are very attracted to that, to gain that information and maybe learn something about how to protect themselves, or learn something about the world and how to be safe maybe, or avoid threats. So we do have, I think, this sort of thing in us to sort of seek things. But what's even more, I guess, disturbing about it is a lot of disorders as well have this propensity. So we would think somebody that's feeling depressed would be motivated to repair their mood. But what we actually find is that depressed people often, because feeling depressed and feeling sad is a familiar mood state, they want to stay in that mood and they want to like purposely seek content that makes them feel even more depressed. And then they go down these sort of internet rabbit holes, and then the algorithm feeds it and all that kind of stuff. It's kind of like when you're sad and you listen to a sad playlist. It's like that feeling.
Yeah.
It's like,
You want to see it mirrored.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. And that really gets to the heart of what this is about, doesn't it? It's the subjective nature of how trigger warnings are used and what they're meant to do versus what they do, and who benefits from them and who suffers because of them. Yeah. And that's the point, isn't it? That you can't take into account how someone will use a piece of information. So even warning someone about that information can have a detrimental effect on them. Yeah,
I think so. And I think it's really that individual difference thing as well that's tricky, because no matter how much evidence we have that like for most people they don't work, and when I mean most people, I mean general population, people with different disorders we've screened for and things like that, but there'll be that one person that will be like, no, but they help me. And then so you can you know, there's always these different arguments that will be brought up about how they help or harm. But I think I think the biggest danger, though, in trigger warnings is assuming that they're doing great benefit to anybody. Because I think no matter how you slice it, I just think they're not really doing much at all of anything. They're definitely not helping, and there's some evidence that they're probably doing some harm. But I think that it's just really bad to assume that as long as you slap a trigger warning on any piece of media, you're protecting people. Or, you know, if a professor just puts a trigger warning on their class material but doesn't think about how the class will receive it or offer any support, or, you know, if it's like a Band-Aid to sort of slap on things and try and fix this mental health crisis that we're always talking about, because it's really easy and it's cheap. It's you know, for social media websites, I can just put it on there and I don't have to do anything else. I don't have to invest anything in anything. So it seems like a really good solution, but it just doesn't do anything. It doesn't help anybody.